this phenomenon of Pretendians, or pretend fake Indian. So people who are not Inuit pretending to be Inuit. Have you heard of this?
I actually haven't.
The judge, she's actually pretty scathing. Listen to this. So she says, theft of Indigenous identity is a uniquely serious form of fraud in my view, and that the true victims of Miss Manji's crimes are the Inuit of Nunavut. Miss Manji has defrauded the Inuit of Nunavut by stealing their identity.
Oh, you can feel the judge's anger in those words. So she's saying that it's worse than regular fraud, or fraud that doesn't involve Indigenous identity theft. So it's an aggravating factor that it was Indigenous people specifically that they were impersonating. And the judge is saying that this appropriation is effectively a continuation of cultural violence or social violence.
And what I just find so fascinating is that the prosecution had only asked for a prison sentence of 24 months, but the judge says Miss Manji's case must serve as a signal to any future Indigenous pretender that the false appropriation of Indigenous identity in a criminal context will draw significant penalty. Accordingly, Miss Manji, I sentence you to 36 months of imprisonment in a federal penitentiary.
That is a harsh sentence. 36 months of imprisonment.
Yeah.
So for fraud, that's a lot. And given the context, so Canada's history, the symbolic violence, the history of it, you can see this is really touching a nerve when it comes to Canadian culture. In Canada, there's a huge discussion around eligibility for awards and how we should appropriately deal with this dark legacy of Canadian past. And there are people who disagree that we should right wrongs with money. But there are other people who think that that's absolutely the only way we're ever going to get people to any semblance of
and
equality.
I suppose it's that conversation about the kind of complex nature of this case and all of these deeper conversations that it opens, but also the heavy-handed sentence that was given. This is the reason why this story has kind of caused headlines around the world. I think even though at the start of our chat, I said that sometimes I think those cultural identities, the labels can be a bit confusing. Sometimes they can be restrictive. I can totally see why, particularly in instances like this, communities hold them so dear because they've already been exploited so much. Do we feel in another circumstance, let's say, that anybody could ever be a genuine pretendian? They really believe that they are from a certain community when they aren't necessarily born into it. It does, I don't know if you remember that case, it reminds me a little bit of, there was an American woman who was white but genuinely believed she was black. Do you know the one that I'm talking about?
I do. And it almost, it's tricky, right? Because it's a question of identity and how do we define the boundaries of identity. So a lot of identity is self-selected, but a lot of things are also not, right? You don't self-select your nationality and your national identity particularly. That is something that you either have that passport or you don't, or you have that sort of right to be there or you don't. And I feel with cultural heritage, it's a bit more fuzzy. So, this is a big conversation in Canada, is how much percentage-wise of your background being Indigenous makes you Indigenous.
Yeah.
And the answer is usually, the real answer is that's not how it works, but the sort of informal answer is often up to 1/8. I think taking the identity of a marginalized community is also different than adopting the identity of a privileged community. I don't know.
So me sitting and saying I'm a white person is not as bad as you portraying that you would be South Asian.
I think that's right. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And that it comes back to convoluted discussions on certain levels of positive discrimination that are put in place to kind of redress the balance that certain communities have gone through. They're there for a reason, right? They're there to kind of address that inequality. So I do think somebody hijacking that is problematic.
Yeah. But then again, I'm back to that sort of, how much of your background needs to be a certain whatever to be part of a community. If one of your grandparents is black, but you are very white-skinned, or one of your parents, I feel there is a question of how much...
Or it could be, for example, I'm a mixed South Asian woman. Would I... Because I've come up against this a few times where I think to myself, should I access certain opportunities or let's say even scholarships that have been put aside for somebody like me who I could perfectly access because I'm, of South Asian heritage, but I feel I am privileged. Is this making sense? It's kind of like you come up against, should I just be entitled to it because my grandparents came from a certain place? Or should I give that to somebody who maybe has genuinely faced more adversity than me?
Well, it's the spirit of it.
Yeah.
It's whether or not this is in line with the spirit of this award or this privilege or this thing I can access because of something I am. And you're absolutely right. I think there's lots of things that, I mean, I'm queer, and so there's things that I could probably access that I wouldn't access because I know there are people who need it much more than I do. And I am a privileged bisexual person, and this is not like I'm not suffering from it in the way that some people are.